Chapter 12. The Idea of Esotericism. For a long time, the people attending Ouspensky's meetings in the Warwick Gardens room remained more or less the same. A new face appeared occasionally for a few meetings, and would then be seen no more, nor was it surprising that there were so few newcomers, for we had been forbidden to speak to anybody about what we called the work. We had even been asked to hide from our friends the fact that we were attending Ouspensky's meetings. But one evening, and quite unexpectedly, Ouspensky announced that he was now in a position to accept a limited number of new people, and that we had his permission to talk to those of our friends whom we thought might be suitable. The question was immediately asked, how can we decide who is suitable and who is not suitable? Ouspensky agreed that this was an exceedingly difficult matter to judge. He said that the St. Petersburg and Moscow groups had often expressed surprise at the lack of interest and understanding shown by their friends when G had given them permission to speak to others of the ideas of the system. Some of those whom they had approached said that there was nothing at all new in the ideas. Others replied that they were not particularly interested in what they had been told, and yet others gave it as their firm conviction that it was no good going to anybody else for a ready-made philosophy of life, but that it had to be found and worked out for oneself. And, having expressed this view, they dismissed the subject from their minds for good and went on living as they had done before, blindly and without thought. But sometimes, and quite often unexpectedly, friends who, at first, had been dismissed as unsuitable, had shown a very real interest in G's ideas and a keen desire to hear more. It was usually easier, Ouspensky said, to say who was unsuitable than to decide who was suitable. He warned us against regarding the psychological methods we were using as being in any way appropriate to the needs of people who required psychiatric help. The fourth way, he said, begins above the ordinary level of life. It is very difficult to follow and is highly unsuited to the needs of the sick. The methods we employ may even make psychiatric cases worse, and it is of the greatest importance that you should realize that we are not a clinic for the treatment of the mentally unstable. The names of several well-known men were mentioned as suitable and highly desirable recruits, but Ouspensky smiled. They have too much personal luggage, he said. Highly successful people usually think that they know everything already and are unwilling to consider the possibility that some of their ideas may be wrong and may have to be abandoned. Whenever people of this kind hear of the idea of inner growth or evolution, they visualize this growth as starting from where they are, which would, of course, mean that their personalities and all their inherent weaknesses would increase also with this growth. Such people do not realize the need for destroying anything in themselves as a preliminary to obtaining anything new. No, very successful people are usually too self-satisfied to be of any use to us. Perhaps the only quality which can be said to make a person suitable for the work is that he should already be a little disillusioned with ordinary life and, still more important, be a little disillusioned with himself, and of course it is essential that he should possess a magnetic center. On being asked what this term magnetic center meant, Ouspensky replied that having no will and being ruled by his personality rather than by essence, a modern Western man could be said to live almost entirely under the law of accident. He reacted automatically to whatever influences he happened to be exposed to, and since he had no say in what these influences were, it was accident which controlled his life. If the various influences to which a man responded were examined more carefully, they would be found to be of two kinds. Ouspensky then drew figure 11 on the board, and said the first, and by far the commonest, kind of influences man encountered was created within and by life itself, and this he would call A influences. A influences included such accidental happenings as the country in which we happened to have been born, the family of which we were a member, our education, our social standing, the ideas and contemporary customs to which we were being constantly subjected, and finally the great political and national events in which we were engulfed, including the great accidents of war and peace. But we occasionally came across B influences, which were mixed up with A influences, but which had originated outside the circle of ordinary life. The distinguishing feature of B influences was that they had come from a higher level and were conscious in origin. They had indeed been deliberately created by more highly evolved men and had been cast into the whirlpool of life in order that they might give guidance to the few people capable of recognizing their higher origin and of understanding and utilizing them. B influences of this second kind were to be found incorporated in religious and philosophical teachings, and they were also occasionally met with in objective works of art and literature. Thrown thus into the maelstrom of ordinary life, B influences, like everything else in that whirlpool, were subject to the law of accident, so that it was entirely a matter of chance whether we met them or not, and whether we recognized their true nature or not, profited by them or neglected them. So I'm going to briefly describe figure 11. So it says, represents the various influences to which an individual man may be subjected. There's A, B, and C. The dark crescent represents magnetic center. V equals life. A equals influences created in life itself. B equals influences created outside life but thrown into the general welter of life influences. C is conscious influences originating in esoteric circles. H1 and H2 equals men connected indirectly with conscious influences. So V is a big circle, and then you have outside of that there's a circle of conscious influences. Then that is going to be linking to H2, which is a circle within the circle of V, the circle of life. H1 is connected to H2, and then H1 is connected to individual man. And then within individual man, there is that crescent he describes, M, which is magnetic center, and then the circle of individual man. So you have A influences, B influences from within life heading towards individual man, and then the H1 coming into contact with individual man. And I'm going to return to the text. Men differ, continued Ouspensky, with respect to their capacity to discriminate between these two kinds of influences, A and B. One individual feels no difference in quality between them, whilst another senses a certain weight in B, which does not exist in influence A. A man who is sensitive to this difference in quality between influences A and B is also a man who has come to the conclusion that it is impossible to understand the universe in terms of itself, that a great mystery lies behind not only the universe, but also behind his own existence on this earth. He may not be a religious man in the narrower sense in which that word is used, but he experiences moments of wonder and of an intuitive belief in the existence of something infinitely higher than himself. Influences B have a very definite effect on a man of this kind, and he puts them on one side and links them up with ideas of a similar nature which he has previously come across. In the course of time he acquires a small treasure house of these B influences, which stimulates the growth in him of a new faculty to which G has given the name magnetic center. If this new function in him continues to obtain nourishment and escapes neglect owing to the fierce competition of ordinary mechanical existence, it will impart a certain orientation to his thoughts and emotions, so that he is always on the lookout for more knowledge of this kind. Eventually he may have the good fortune to come across a person who is in a position to give him help, say, by bringing him into contact with someone connected either either directly or indirectly with conscious influences, which are labeled C in the diagram, or the connection he makes with conscious influences may be a less direct one than this, by way of several intermediaries. In any case, the man in question passes at this point, so far as his search for knowledge is concerned, outside the sphere of accident, and comes within the range of conscious influences. This being so, he no longer depends for direction on his magnetic center, for this has accomplished all that was required of it. Henceforth, he will be dependent on guiding forces of a more conscious nature. According to G, magnetic center begins to be formed, if it is formed at all, in the earlier years of life, and whether anyone has developed a magnetic center or not will depend to a great extent on how he was brought up as a child. Because of the decline of religion and family life in the West, the growing child is likely to meet fewer and fewer B influences in his home, and this means that his emotional faculties and the higher parts of his nature will receive very little nourishment. Nor is this the only way in which the child suffers neglect during his earlier formative years. A young child is far more sensitive to home atmosphere than many people realize, and instead of receiving positive teaching from the adults who surround him, he often receives from them only negative ideas, such as that nothing in the universe has any real meaning, that man is a lone voyager in a waste of space, and that those who think otherwise than this are dreamers and impractical idealists. The brand of humanism advocated by many of our intellectuals provides very poor emotional nourishment for the growing child. Uspensky warned us that a magnetic center was not necessarily an infallible guide to the truth, and that it sometimes mistook a influence for a B influence. Or if a man might be led by an unreliable magnetic center, first in one direction and then in another, and in the end be so disheartened by his many mistakes, that by his failure to find anything worthwhile, that he adopted the only remedy available to the spiritually bankrupt person and became a cynic. And yet another person, a magnetic center might lack persistence and, although it possessed the capacity to discriminate between A and B influences, it might abandon the search for truth. Finally, it had to be remembered that, although magnetic center might be capable of bringing a man into contact with conscious influences, it could never ensure that he made good use of his opportunities. After a man had established direct contact with knowledge from a higher level, he depended for further guidance on two things, his teacher and on his understanding of what his teacher told him. But he was now in a much stronger position than he had formerly been, and many ideas and feelings which previously had been vague and uncertain now became for him much more clearly defined. He also enjoyed the immense advantage of knowing what kind of effort it was profitable for him to make and what efforts were useless. He could be sure also that, if he made the right kind of effort, he would in due course receive inner assurance that he was moving in the right direction. In other words, he would have pragmatic proof that his work was yielding positive results, however small these results might be. At a later meeting, Uspensky enlarged on a statement he had previously made, that the fourth way started on a higher level than that of ordinary life. He said that the moment when magnetic center brought a man into contact with someone who actually knew the way was known as the first threshold or step in the way. From this threshold, a stairway started which led upwards to a slightly higher level, and it was only by passing up this staircase that the traveler could enter the way itself. But to ascend the stairway he required the help of others. Uspensky added that, whilst ascending the stairway, the man could be sure of nothing, and was sometimes consumed with doubts about the trustworthiness of his guide, the accuracy of the knowledge he was receiving, and finally about his own capacity to profit by it. But after he had passed the second threshold, at the top of the staircase, he was standing on the way itself, his doubts disappeared. He knew now that he was facing in the right direction, and that in time he might even become independent of his guide, and know where he was going and how to get there. He was also a little less liable to lose all he had gained, and would find it more difficult to return to former ways of living and of thinking, should he decide to give up all further efforts. Uspensky more than once expressed the opinion that the new people who were coming into the work were less well prepared for it than their predecessors had been. He also declared that the men and women who had joined G in Moscow and St. Petersburg during the First World War were better material than we were, and he was even inclined to think that his latter recruits in London were of a still lower standard than we were. This meant that more preliminary work had to be done on them, and that they were more dependent on help in ascending the staircase which led to the way. These statements of Ouspensky gave rise to a discussion amongst ourselves as to why, at a time when such rapid advances were being made in all fields of knowledge, man possessed so little discrimination and understanding. For every invention of benefit to mankind, such as the many great discoveries in the fields of medicine, there came an invention of a diabolical nature, such as the atom bomb. Why was there all this confusion and lack of understanding amongst men? It was because knowledge and understanding were entirely different things. In order to understand something, the relationship between the part and the whole had to be seen, and the chief characteristic of modern research was that the whole was being broken down into such small pieces that their relationship to the whole was lost. Specialists spent their lives gazing at particles of information through their magnifying glasses without any hope of relating what they saw to the world in which they lived. It was not surprising that there existed an immense amount of information but very little understanding. I'm going to reread this paragraph because I think it's extremely important and very true to today's world, especially. These statements of Ouspensky gave rise to a discussion amongst ourselves as to why, at a time when such rapid advances were being made in all fields of knowledge, man possessed so little discrimination and understanding. For every invention of benefit to mankind, such as the many great discoveries in the field of medicine, there came an invention of a diabolical nature, such as the atom bomb. Why was there all this confusion and lack of understanding amongst men? It was because knowledge and understanding were entirely different things. In order to understand something, the relationship between the part and the whole had to be seen, and the chief characteristic of modern research was that the whole was being broken down into such small pieces that the relationship to the whole was lost. Specialists spent their lives gazing at particles of information through their magnifying glasses without any hope of relating what they saw to the world in which they lived. It was not surprising that there existed an immense amount of information, but very little understanding. This book was written in the 60s, so now with the internet, we're even more flooded with information, and we probably have even less understanding than they did then. Anyway, back to the text. A question was asked at the next meeting about the source of bee influences. We had been told that bee influences were conscious in origin and that they had been thrown into life for a certain purpose. Who were the people responsible for this? It was obvious from his expression that Ouspensky welcomed this question. This brings us to the very important and much debated question of esotericism, he began, and then went on to explain that the humanity to which we belonged, and the humanity of which historians alone wrote, constituted the outermost of several circles of humanity, a circle which was often called the circle of the confusion of tongues. The 11th chapter of Genesis opens with the words, "And the whole world was of one language and of one speech." This statement corresponded with G's views that there had once been a time in the world's history when people were in direct touch with higher knowledge and lived under its influence. The chapter then continues thus: "And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had bricks for stone, and slime they had for mortar." This account of a journey was interpreted symbolically by some authorities, and, according to them, the journey from the east into a valley meant that the people who had formerly lived in accordance with esoteric principles now abandoned them and relied on their own much lower level of understanding. Then came the statement that they made bricks instead of stone and slime instead of mortar. In other words, they invented their own truths and imagined they could do. The first result of all this complete reliance on themselves and their own ideas was the building and confusion of the Tower of Babel. But, continued Ouspensky, esoteric knowledge still managed to survive. Within the great circle of confusion of tongues, there still continued to exist 3 concentric circles of more highly evolved men. The esoteric, or or innermost circle of all consisted of people who had attained the maximum development possible for man, full consciousness, unity, and will. See Figure 12. I'm going to briefly go over Figure 12 here. So we have three concentric circles as he described. So outside of the outermost circle is labeled confusion of tongues. Within the next circle, there's the exoteric circle. Within that circle, there is the mesoteric circle. And in the innermost circle is the esoteric circle. All right, back to the text. But, continued Ouspensky, esoteric knowledge still managed to survive. Within the great circle of confusion of tongues, there still continued to exist three concentric circles of more highly evolved men. The esoteric, or innermost circle of all, consisted of people who had attained the maximum development possible to man, full conscious unity and will. Men of this high level of development were quite incapable of performing actions contrary to their understanding, or having an understanding which could not be expressed also in action. Nor was it possible for there to be any misunderstanding between those who belonged to this circle, and this meant that all their actions were coordinated to a common aim. The next circle to this was the mesoteric or middle circle, in which were found the same psychological qualities found in the innermost circle, the only difference between the two being that the knowledge of the mesoteric circle was of a more theoretical nature than that of the esoteric circle. The third circle was the exoteric circle. Those who belonged to it possessed most of the qualities of the inner two circles, but their knowledge was of a still more theoretical nature, so that it was often only philosophical. This difference in the quality of knowledge could be expressed in the statement that, whereas a member of the mesoteric circle calculated, a member of the exoteric circle contemplated. This being so, the understanding of those belonging to the exoteric circle could not always find an expression in action, as the understanding of the inner circles did, but it was impossible for there to be any misunderstanding between different individuals in the exoteric circle. What one understood, all the others understood in the same way. Beyond these concentric circles there lay the outer region of the confusion of tongues, the great area in which dwelt the whole of the rest of humanity. There could never be, and never had been, any real understanding between individuals inhabiting this outer region. It was possible for a few people to agree about things of very little general importance to mankind, but even then only for a comparatively short time. In this outer circle, everybody understood questions of importance to humanity in an entirely subjective way, and the only hope for those who dwelt in this land of the confusion of tongues was first that they should eventually realize the true state of affairs there, and second that they should seek the help of the exoteric circle. It was only in this manner that understanding could be reached. At this point, Ouspensky rose from his chair, went over to the blackboard on which he had drawn the three inner circles, and made 4 gaps in the outermost esoteric circle, which he said represented the entrances to the 4 different ways of development, the ways of the fakir, yogi, and monk, and the 4th way. I found it very difficult to picture to myself in terms of geography, history, and everyday life this nucleus of more highly evolved humanity, which was supposed to have exerted so strong an influence on the past history of culture. How had these people managed to survive the upheavals of countless wars and revolutions? Did the men and women who formed this more conscious nucleus lead some form of community life, or did they and their disciples live in small groups in the remoter parts of Asia? The Theosophists believed in the existence of certain masters or rishis living in the remote vastness of the Himalayas, but I have never taken this idea of the rishis seriously, but perhaps, after all, their belief in the existence of these great leaders was justified. When Ouspensky was asked by a member of the group whether the highly evolved men had spoken about he had spoken about still managed to survive. He replied that we had no reason to suppose that they had entirely disappeared. Pressed to give up Pressed to give us some idea of the number of evolved men now in existence, he replied that this was an unanswerable question, but, he continued, there is an ancient tradition that a man who has managed to evolve is under the obligation of becoming the teacher to 100 other people. So, even if we started with only number 7 men, and each of these instructed 100 disciples how to attain the level of man number 6, and each of these in turn brought 100 others up to the level of man number 5, the output in more highly evolved men would still be very considerable. Diagrams can only represent a certain number of ideas, and too much must not be expected of them. The figure showing the various circles of humanity is a good example of the limitations of diagrams. It shows a certain relationship between the various levels of humanity, but taken too literally it can easily become misleading. Culture does not spread by means of mass movements, but through the agency of individuals and of small groups of individuals. Mankind did not advance on a broad front through the Paleolithic, Neolithic, Bronze, and Iron Ages. For example, all of these epochs existed simultaneously in different parts of Europe. So also it is likely that more highly developed men live only in very small and scattered communities which maintain only a loose contact with each other. This, at any rate, is the impression which I have obtained from reading Gurdjieff's as yet unpublished book, Remarkable Men I Have Met. Ouspensky was particularly interested in this subject of esotericism, and in the kindred subject of esoteric schools. In A New Model for the Universe, he writes that these schools are hidden from the eyes of ordinary humanity, but that their influence persists uninterruptedly in history. Their aim, so far as we are able to understand it, is twofold, namely, to help races which have lapsed back into barbarism and to produce teachers. According to tradition, the following historical personages came from esoteric schools: Moses, Gautama Buddha, John the Baptist, Jesus Christ, Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato, as well as the more mythical Orpheus, Hermes Trismegistus, Krishna, and Rama. Ouspensky also includes in the list of school products the builders of the pyramids and the Sphinx, a few of the old alchemists, the priests of the Egyptian and Greek mysteries, the architects of the Gothic cathedrals built in the Middle Ages, and the founders of certain orders of Sufis and dervishes. For me, the idea that esoteric schools and teachers had survived the violence and persecution of humanity, and had succeeded in passing on their knowledge by word of mouth over a period of several thousands of years, was a difficult one either to accept or to reject. One thing that could be said in its favor was that it explained what was otherwise extremely puzzling: the appearance at different times in history of teachers who have appeared suddenly upon the scene, imparted to a small following doctrines of an esoteric nature, and then either died or gone somewhere else. Men such as Pythagoras, Apollonius of Tyana, Ammonius Saccas, the teacher of Plotinus, and Saint Martin, La Philosophie Iconu. To this list of teachers could be added a great many other names, including that of the man whose ideas are being studied in this book. Gurdjieff was no ordinary man, and it was impossible to be long in his presence without realizing this fact. But how and where had he acquired his knowledge and his being? In Remarkable Men I Have Met, just a quick note from me, Remarkable Men I Have Met, I believe this is just the same book as Meetings with Remarkable Men, which I think it's published under now. Back to the text. He describes monasteries in which he lived for many months in remote and inaccessible parts of Central Asia, and he writes also of ancient religious brotherhoods and of other ancient religious orders. Having met G and also read his book, I am perhaps less skeptical than I formerly was of the existence of a small esoteric kernel of more highly evolved men. During the later years of his teaching, Ouspensky returned repeatedly to the question which interested him so greatly: the existence somewhere of genuine esoteric schools. He pointed out what is undoubtedly true, that a man is able to do very little by himself, since everything in life is so arranged as to make him forget his aim. But in a school he found himself living with people not of his own choosing, people with whom it might be very difficult for him to live and work. Tension was thereby created between himself and these others, so that he was continually being reminded of the need for him to struggle against his identifications and his negative emotions. Moreover, in a school he had the immense advantage of being under the constant supervision of a teacher who saw him more clearly than he saw himself. Ouspensky said that work in a school took three forms: work on oneself, work with other people, and work for the larger aim of the school. The law of seven made it necessary that these three lines of work should proceed simultaneously, so that whenever one form of work slowed down at an interval, it received a shock from the activity of the other two lines of work. For example, when work on oneself reached the interval mi-fa, an additional shock could be imparted to it by one or both of the other two lines of work becoming more active. I'm going to reread that. For example, when work on oneself reached the interval mi-fa, an additional shock could be imparted to it by one or both of the other two lines of work becoming more active. On being asked what was meant by the third line of work or the larger aim, Ouspensky answered that this would gradually become apparent to the more senior members of the school, but that it was profitable for everybody to think about it from the very beginning. The teacher had a very definite aim in undertaking all the work he was doing, and it was for those who profited from his labors to study this aim and to help him in any way they could. As had previously been said, Ouspensky never claimed to have established a school. All that he ever said on this subject was that it would be helpful to us to live as much as possible under school conditions and to make a special study of school methods. At first, it was quite impossible to reproduce the necessary conditions in London, but in 1936 a large house and estate were purchased at Virginia Water, where many members of the group lived and to which others came during the weekends. This allowed us to observe ourselves living in unusual surroundings, and when engaged in unfamiliar and often uncongenial tasks, and much new knowledge of ourselves was thereby obtained. We discovered, for example, how much we were the slaves of our bodies, and how essential it was for us to become less subservient to their demands. It was true that the living conditions at Virginia Water were much less rigorous than were those at G's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, but they were sufficiently difficult to allow of our observing ourselves in a number of trying circumstances, and in different stages of fatigue, hunger, and irritation. Ouspensky sometimes referred to a school in which he was very interested, a school which was formerly established in Gobelins during the summer and which moved to Italy for the winter months. It appeared to be only a school for painters, but he said that this was merely the facade behind which more important activities took place, namely, the study of ideas of an esoteric nature. He also said that there were reasons for believing that Ibsen and Alexis Tolstoy, the cousin of Leo the writer, were members of this school, but that Ibsen had later withdrawn from it. In his play The Master Builder, he gave his reasons for doing so. It will be recalled that the Master Builder explains to Elsa that he no longer wants to construct great cathedrals and to climb up dizzy heights, but intends to devote himself instead to the building of modest homes for ordinary men and women. And the reason for the Master Builder's abandonment of his former ideals was that he felt that it was his duty to look after his sick and disappointed wife. I am of the opinion that Ouspensky always hoped to make contact with the school, perhaps working somewhere in the Middle East, for so much had been destroyed in Europe by the war and by the Russian Revolution that it was unlikely that any esoteric school had managed to survive there. Ouspensky was deeply impressed by the Mevlevi dervishes when he visited their headquarters in Constantinople in the year 1908, and he hoped to return some day to renew his talks with their sheikh. But soon after his visit to Turkey had started to westernize herself, and in the process, the Mevlevi dervishes were banished from Constantinople. That the idea of schools was constantly in Ouspensky's mind during the last 10 years of his work in London is strongly suggested by a remark he made to me shortly before the publication of his book, A New Model of the Universe. Quote, "It will be very interesting," he said, with a studied calm which had an undertone of emotion, "if through this book of mine we establish a link with other schools." His hope was never realized.